Good evening, YouTube. So today I have another something special for you, and it concerns this book, Bias and Mental Testing, that Arthur Jensen he published in 1980, and this, of course, is the 800-page book that deals with assessing bias and mental testing, right? And insofar as this is related to construct validity and all these other nice things, reliability theory, and so on. This book essentially provides a long-form introduction to this that's readable for a smart reader without an advanced background in statistics. Some years ago, we managed to get a copy of this book, and it is a mammoth book. It's 800 pages, and you can totally read it on the internet for free, because we put it on the Arthur Jensen memorial site, where you can also read essentially everything else he has written and all the other books. I particularly suggest reading this book, which is actually published in response to the thing we're talking about tonight. And the thing we're talking about tonight is this show, the Phil Donahue show. It's a kind of typical American talk show of sorts, and the thing that's special about it, there are two things I think is special about it, and one of them is that it features a lot of actual serious intellectuals that come there for extended kind of talk and debate, not just these Hollywood people that they have on modern talk shows and kind of dumb comedian takes on politics. Here, for instance, we see obviously Donald Trump, and if you go to the Wikipedia, we can also learn that apparently it's one of the longest running TV shows, or these TV talk show things ever, 26 years. If we go to YouTube, we can find that many of these episodes are in fact already available. Here's the Trump one from 87, and here's one with Milton Friedman from 79, and there's the infamous one with Philip Rushton in 90, and there's even Ayn Rand also in 79. Unfortunately, if we go to, for instance, the Pirate Bay, we get this picture. There's essentially not much to download here. We would like that there would be an entire archive of these videos so everybody can see what it is that Americans thought was so interesting for 26 years on this talk show and all these old episodes. So, of course, I hope that someone will release all these. Today, we're going to be making one step towards this, because we are releasing the Arthur Jensen Phil Donahue talk show episode, which I believe Jensen himself sent to Helmuth Nyborg, or Nyborg as you call him, and on a VHS tape that we have then digitized and restored some quality insofar as we could figure out, and you will be watching it now. Enjoy.
1969 came out with a report which suggested that blacks are inferior to whites in terms of intelligence quotient, in terms of innate ability to learn. Do you accept that description of the core of the controversy?
I don't use the word inferior. Blacks are lower in IQ and other kinds of mental test scores than whites by about 15 IQ points.
And I don't have to tell you, a firestorm of controversy was generated by that observation by you. No less a figure than Margaret Mead called for your professorship to be stripped from you and called for your dismissal from the faculty of the university at which you taught. And I also don't have to tell you, an academic person, the tremendous consequences of your position if you are correct. And also the fact that there are people in this country, there are people in the sensitive age of race and prejudice who see this as just about the worst thing that could happen to the global community. You'll agree?
Yes, right. I don't agree that it's the worst thing that could happen, but I agree that there are people who believe that it is.
The part of the criticism of your observation has to do with what testers and academicians feel is the essential nature of evaluating IQ, and that tests administered to young people or anybody are culturally biased to favor the majority of the people in whose community the tests are administered.
Yes.
They're developed by white people. they're administered by white people, and they're evaluated by white people. And what non-white would want to have his intelligence evaluated under those weighted circumstances? Not a bad question.
It's a very good question, and that's why I've devoted several years of research to finding out the answers to that question.
And you've discovered, among other things, what?
Well, tests are, of course, widely used in schools, colleges, industry, and the armed forces. And it's very important to find out if these tests are biased against minority groups and in favor of the white majority. And the conclusions of my research are that the tests are not biased for any native-born, English-speaking minority group in this country. Tests do the same job for those groups as they do for the white majority.
Yeah.
As the scores have the same meaning for any valid use of the tests.
All right. If you're going to present a thesis which places places a race at the bottom of the IQ scale, then I trust you believe there is somebody who's at the top.
There probably is. I'm not sure we know which group is at the top and which group is at the bottom.
Why don't we? I mean, if you're smart enough to tell us
all groups haven't been tested.
why can't you tell us who's smart?
We can say that the white population of the United States scores higher on all kinds of mental tests, not just IQ tests, but every kind of mental test that's used widely, than the black population of the United States, on the average. There's a good deal of overlap between the distributions, of course. 15% of blacks exceed the white average. But that difference we are sure of. Now, there's no question about it.
15% of blacks exceed the white average.
Yes, whereas 50% of whites exceed the white average, of course.
Okay, this is a terribly complicated dialogue, and I don't even know whether it's possible to make any sense given the interruptions in this program, and we're going to try. And I want to take you back. Once you decide that somebody skews lower, then you have to deal with the inevitable fact that somebody is going to be at the top of this intelligent quotation evaluation.
That's
and I guess I want to know why, since you bring so much vigor to telling us, and look at the size of this book. This may be the all-time heaviest book we've ever sold on our program.
Probably.
So all of this energy you've given to this business of presenting us with this very complicated and controversial thesis, but you won't give us any information. You suddenly become intellectually incapacitated when it comes to the issue of who may be at the top, assuming...
As I say, I don't know who's at the top, except for the groups that I've already mentioned. Those are the groups that have been thoroughly researched.
White Americans?
White Americans and black Americans. There are a few other groups that have been researched. Orientals have been researched a little, but we don't know nearly as much about Orientals, Japanese and Chinese.
Yes. In an article in Time magazine about your thesis,
right,
the authors of the article suggest that the debate about who's smart seems to swirl about Jews and Japanese.
And
Jews
Chinese.
And Chinese. Or I would say Jews and Asians. Can we say that?
Yes.
Although we may be comparing apples and oranges.
Well, in this country, the Orientals, Chinese, Japanese, and Jews could be called the intellectual elite in our particular society today.
It's clear that Jews make a disproportionate contribution to culture, the arts, and academe than their numbers would indicate.
Absolutely.
Now,
and so do the Orientals.
All right. Now, what does this person, this PhD from the University of California, who's given his life to the business of determining what we can measure in terms of man's intelligence, and woman's, pardon me, what does he say to this general conclusion about Jews and Asians? I mean, are you in agreement, or why would you back away from research on whether or not?
Well, I'm not backing away from research.
All right. Well, give us your general feeling. Do you think they're right?
Well, yes, this is true. I mean, as a fact, this is simply a
So you take
fact.
100 Asians off the street and 100, say, well, what do you want to say, Caucasian Americans, and you're going to find more innate intellectual ability among the 100 Asians than among the 100...
I'm not sure about innate. On the average, the Asians and Jews will score somewhat higher on IQ tests, and will show the effects of this in the occupations that they hold and so forth.
Okay, but why would you quarrel about the word innate? I thought that's the whole controversy here. Is it environment, or is it heredity? Can I juxtapose the words innate and heredity?
Yes, I think it's both. But again, it has not been researched with respect to those particular groups. I suspect that both genetic and environmental factors are involved in these group differences.
Including blacks and whites?
Yes.
So you're not
I'm more sure of it there. I mean, I think it's more plausible to think of it there because the differences are considerably larger. The differences between Orientals and Caucasians and between Jews and Gentiles in our society is a rather small difference, very small compared to the black-white difference.
I see. All right, how do you deal with this basic page 1 psychology primer question about heredity versus environment?
Well, the fact is that a large part of the variation among persons in intelligence is due to genetic factors. It's inherited, it's innate.
Okay. And you're saying that's the majority of the determination?
Yes, at least 50% and probably something closer to 70 or 80% of the variation among people in intelligence is due to genetic variation among people and not due to differences in their environments.
So you're only counting for 20% as
25%,
as an environmental
something
factor.
like that, right.
You see,
And you don't have to take my word for that. You can look that up in the very latest edition of the Encyclopedia Britannica. I won't take up program time to read you the quotation from that, but they say exactly what I have said. It's in my pocket here if anyone wanted to check it, but I don't want to take up time reading what I just said.
Okay, but given the terribly complicated nature of the human brain, its neurons and its all that energy.
10 billion neurons.
I mean, it's just the most staggering physical thing there is.
Absolutely.
Okay. And its ability to function rests critically on the manner of its nourishment and the manner of the emotional treatment of the body and soul in which it rests.
That's certainly true.
In infancy. Did the mother give the baby infamil regularly? Was it breastfed? What were the proteins?
Right.
What was the nutrient application at the time the baby was growing? I don't understand how if that's the case, it sounds to me like environment ought to have a bigger role to play in how well we do the X's and O's on your multiple choice tests when we're 18 years old and taking the SAT test in high school.
These things you've mentioned are all very important, but we're talking about variations among people in intelligence. And the variations in people's nutrition and environments is not great enough to account for more than about 20 or 25% of the variation in their intelligence. The rest of the variation comes from their genes.
Once you introduce race into the issue of who's smart or who has, I guess you wouldn't agree with that word either, with regard to capacity. All right, capacity to learn. Once you introduce race into that, then you have to deal with the genetic nature of race and the fact that most people of color, especially in this country, have white genes.
That's right. About 20% of the 20% or so of the ancestry of the average American black is Caucasian ancestry.
All right, so how doesn't that complicate the business of making these broad brush, universally applicable findings?
No, it really doesn't, and I've written extensively about that, but again, this is one of those things that gets into technicalities that are difficult to discuss on this kind of show. But it does not really create any insuperable problem. And as a matter of fact, you say that we can't avoid the issue of genetics. Well, I do in this whole book. I haven't avoided it. I simply said that I'm dealing with bias in tests independently of the question of whatever causes the differences. I'm simply trying to find out whether the tests themselves are at fault, whether they are responsible for the observed differences, and my conclusion is that they are not.
The tests pass in your book.
Absolutely. And that we have to then look elsewhere than to the tests to explain the differences that are observed between blacks and whites.
And when you look elsewhere, you go to your your predecessors, Bert and others, the people who...
Well, I couldn't go to Bert on that because Bert never said a thing about racial differences.
Okay, but you go to this collection of men. I think that it's rooted in England, is it not? The whole business of whether...
Yes, the science of genetics, in a sense, began in England, of human genetics, and the interest in human abilities began in England with Sir Francis Galton.
Yeah.
And then, of course, spread over the world scientifically. But every science has a beginning somewhere, and many other sciences began in England as well.
Yeah. You know, aren't you a little self-conscious about... I'm amazed at the enthusiasm with which you present your findings in view of the enormous consequences. This throws strikes at racism. It fuels the whole notion of inferiority, and it also types the people whom you are describing as lower on the chart. It predestines their own future. They'll fulfill your prophecy. That's the concern.
No, I don't believe that. And also, as I say in my book on the very last page, I believe that tests, since they are colorblind, can help us realize one of the important ideals of democracy, and that is that we treat every individual in accord with his own individual characteristics, and not in terms of his group membership.
But I don't
the tests can read through cultural background.
You know, in the 3rd grade, I was in the lowest reading level. I mean, we had the bluebirds and the brownies, and I forget, I was a Popeye or something. I forget what it was.
So was Einstein.
Now, wait a minute. This is not a grandstand effort to say, you know, look at me, I got a TV show, because there are many people watching who will not be surprised at the findings of the 3rd grade with me. But the point here is this, that for a long time I went through grammar school thinking of myself as a Popeye and never really expecting to be much more than a Popeye. Once you type me, I will get about the business of proving the accuracy of the type. And I'm not pretending to be the first person to raise this question. How can we possibly evaluate the potential contribution, the G factor, the general intelligence of so complicated an animal as the human being? Just the physiology itself is complicated. The different way he collects and computerizes information, all those things, to pretend to say how smart or what potential I have on the basis of an IVM multiple choice simplistic answer is absurd on its face.
Yes, it does seem so, doesn't it? It's almost counterintuitive, but as a matter of fact, we can do that. It's done in a statistical probabilistic way. You can't make a hard and fast prediction about any one person, but you can make statistically probabilistic statements about probable outcomes. We can give the SAT test to college applicants and make good predictions as to who will and will not fail in college. There are errors, of course. Every kind of measurement has errors, and the predictions are far from perfect, but they are better than no prediction at all, and they save a lot of grief from persons entering colleges they're not suited for, and in terms of the colleges getting the kinds of persons they can do the most for, and so on through the use of tests. The armed forces, for example, claim that they save close to $500 million a year by using tests that they would have as an expense if they didn't use the test to select people for special training
But
programs.
economic efficiency is no excuse for making a guy a truck driver for the rest of his life, no offense to truck drivers, when he might have been a computer analyst if some yahoo somewhere at an outpost in Texas hadn't administered badly a test that told him that he was something that he wasn't at all.
Right. And you'll see that I say the same thing in my book. I'm not a testing enthusiast. I'm not an advocate of test publishers or anything like that. But we're going to have tests in our society on a larger and larger scale. And so it's necessary to find out how to make these tests better, how to use them most fairly for all concerned, and how to avoid abuses of tests. And there are abuses of tests. I have a whole chapter in my book on the uses and abuses of tests.
I'm not an anthropologist or an anatomist, but it looks to me like your whole thesis gets down to a question of dermatology rather than... We were talking about skin color, and is pigmentation what makes the difference?
No, absolutely not. Pigmentation is one of the most superficial human characteristics, and the full range of skin color is found in just about every human race. And skin color is totally unimportant. I've never put any emphasis on it. And there's very little emphasis on race per se in my book.
Okay, but take away skin color, and how are you going to tell who's what?
Well, that would be marvelous if we could do that. And
the point is,
I
it's
believe...
the skin color that's allowing you to make these, do this research and draw these conclusions.
No. Now, you see, I'm researching things questions that other people have brought up. I would just assume that we forget all about race and skin color. But society has made an issue of these things. And it says that these tests are biased for these people, so on. So I want to find out if that's true. And if it is true, then we ought to get rid of the tests or improve them in some way to remove this bias. Now, I didn't
How are you going to remove the bias if you step forward to say that however way you test it, whatever compensatory moves you make, however much effort you make to ensure that the tests are not culturally biased, you're still going to come out with a bell curve that shows a black person with not as much intelligence as a white?
That simply happens to be the state of affairs. I didn't start this research with any preconceptions as to what I would find. I do my research and let the chips fall where they may, and I report it as such.
Yeah. This is Arthur R. Jensen. This is the book. It's called Bias in Mental Testing, and we hope you'll join us. Ma'am, you'll stand. We're with Arthur Jensen.
Okay. My main concern is you're talking about the white majority. How can you realistically get a cross-section of this large population? I mean, how can you, make
Because we're so diverse.
Well, oh, absolutely. I have taken a course in testing, and that was one of the biggest things that came out in our course, is that tests are really not that valid because it is so impossible to be able to get a cross-section of all the different. We're extremely different. I mean, there are so many different types of white people in our races and so forth, so how can you classify that?
Yes, well, of course, I'm talking about the average of all of these different white groups. And it is possible to get quite wide surveys of the whole nation. The Armed Forces Qualification Test, for example, has been administered to all males between the ages of 18 and 26 over the whole population. Some of our best standardized tests are based on standardization samples of over 100,000 sampled from every state in the United States. You can take random samples from various school systems. So it is not impossible to get representative samples of the whole country on various tests.
Sir.
Yes, Dr. Jensen?
Yes.
I'd like to know your opinions or your impressions about famous psychologist Watson, who's considered a behaviorist, when he stated so frankly, if you give me 12 men, or 12 babies that is, when they're born, I'll make anything which you would like out of them. I'll make the smartest one or the smartest person, let's say doctors, lawyers, I'll make a criminal out of them. Can you give me your feedback on it?
Yes, he was wrong. I wish he would have been able to tell us how to do that. No one has yet figured it out. And he said that as an article of faith to launch his philosophy of behaviorism. And I don't think anyone believes that today.
Back here.
Yes, some of the children that are going to school, they have said, when I get a test, I just go blank. And I have found that with my children, they're not all the same.
They're not good test takers. You've heard this before, Dr.
Right, yes. There is such a thing as test anxiety. And some people suffer from this test anxiety. And this is why I put much more stock in individually administered tests than in group-administered tests. Group-administered tests have their uses. But if any important decision has to be made about a person, in a clinical sense, or placing a child in a special class or so, that child should be tested individually so that the clinician giving the test can observe the person's degree of cooperation and anxiety and so on. And it's often important to test a person 2 or 3 times so that he gets over this anxiety.
Back here.
Well, actually, back to the previous
Which is not likely to happen in the armed forces, let's make that point. Or when you're testing 5,000 people at a time with SATs. In other words, individual attention is not the hallmark of the mass testing that's going on in this country.
That is true, yes.
I was saying back to that previous question, what that woman was stating, as far as intelligent quotient tests, I mean, there is a certain amount of anxiety and nervousness, but what I am puzzled about is the race, how you really can determine, as far as the races. I mean, accurately, that it is what you say.
Much time. What do you think?
Well, the test can be given to persons of different races in the same way and scored up, and on the average, certain races score lower and some score higher. So that's all I can say briefly.
I just wondered if there'd been any tests done, or what ages the people were that were tested, and then if they were tested again, and the comparison, is there a loss in intelligence between the two groups as they get older?
Generally, between blacks and whites, you mean? Generally, no, but we have found black groups, and I think I was the first to find this and prove it definitively, in very deprived communities, in rural Georgia, for example, where the IQ declines about 1 IQ point a year between the ages of 5 and 16. And I think that's for environmental reasons in that particular instance.
Do you think this can be changed at all with education, or would it take 100 years, or what?
So far, no one knows how to do anything dramatic educationally that has any large effect on IQ. That's all I can say at the moment. I can't predict what may come up in educational innovation, but as of today, we do not know how to raise IQs.
Yes.
I'm a teacher, first of all, and I do feel that IQ, the values are just too high on it. Very often I look at a child in school with a very high IQ who will perform just at an average level. At other times, I get one with 100 IQ who just does outstanding work. So, I mean, I would just assume not to see the IQs until after I have known the child.
Right.
That's a very important point. Let's just make sure we get... Once you give the teacher a list that puts a number against her pupils, that teacher's behavior toward those pupils is inevitably altered, the protestations of these dedicated teachers to the contrary notwithstanding.
Not that much. I agree, and I agree with the lady's statement. I do not advocate giving IQ tests to all children in school. I see no need for it. It seems nonsensical and wasteful. I think a teacher needs to know whether a child has learned what has been taught. I don't think a teacher needs to know a child's IQ. For children who are having special problems in school, then a psychological diagnosis of the problem is important, and a part of the diagnosis is an individually administered IQ test.
But it's just a part of school. The children are tested in first grade and again in fifth grade. Between those years, they are stymied with this. It's just a little stamp on them.
Yes.
You see their charts.
I'm opposed to that. I believe in achievement testing to find out if the children are learning what they're supposed to be taught in school.
Even that sometimes is not very valid. Very often the child is afraid of a test. If they know achievement tests are coming, they will freeze up on you completely. Other times it's 50% guesswork.
Yes, they haven't been tested enough then. The teacher hasn't made enough use of tests, so the children should get over the idea of anxiety.
But what if their parents had a fight the preceding night? What if their father came home drunk?
Yes,
what if their family's breaking?
Right.
But the point is, these
things.
first and fifth grade tests are with them forever.
Yes.
Forever.
Right. You can say the same thing about any kind of human measurement. You see, in taking a person's temperature or whatever, you say, what if he has a hangover? What if he was out too late the night before?
I think your analogy does not destroy the point she's making. We're not talking about the temperature of the human body. We're talking about the future perception of the human being in this world and how she perceives himself.
Yes. Well, a great deal of how a person perceives himself and of how other people perceive that person are based on the person's actual performance in various situations, not on tests. Now, a test may contribute to that if someone knows someone's test score, and I don't advocate that teachers should know children's IQs. They should know whether the child is learning what is being taught.
Okay, there's not a whole thing. Yeah, but in the manner in the emotional way in which the information is received by the teacher, I'm not sure there's a big difference. See, if a teacher sees that a child is not absorbing what has been taught,
well, that should be a source of concern.
Well.
Certainly it should be a source of concern.
But the teacher it's very easy for that teacher to conclude that this is a child who's going to be slower and to present in a way that conveys to the child that the child is expected to be slower, and the child will never be motivated to be faster.
That is a mistake. Then a diagnosis of that child's learning problem should be undertaken, and a program that will improve the child's chances of benefiting from school should be worked out.
And
you can't ignore school failure.
You can't ignore it, but given the fact that we've presented ourselves with this enormous responsibility of teaching millions and millions of our young people,
right,
and the financial conditions in which most public school systems now find themselves, and you happen to be in a city in the midst of this crisis, it is very unlikely that individual, compensatory, sensitive attention is going to be given to this one child in the who comes up on the IBM printout.
That has nothing to do with the psychology of the situation. See, that's an economic policy concern. And you can't blame the test or the science of psychology, which studies individual differences, for these conditions of society.
We'll be back in just a moment. Can you measure human intelligence? How do you do it? How much of it is innate? How much of it is environmental? And how much of it is, are the tests culturally biased? And is it more difficult for some to pass the test than others, not because of any innate inferiority, but because of the manner in which the tests have been developed?
Well, first of all, I have taught elementary school students, and the tests are definitely culturally biased, not only towards blacks, but towards any person.
Against blacks.
I mean, against blacks, but against anybody who has not had certain cultural experiences. I've taught lower-class whites who have not scored well at all. I have taught an exceptional group of black students who come from middle-class backgrounds who have done very well. And I would also like to point out the fact that I am a product of black schools. I did not score well on standardized tests until I took it upon myself to take special remedial courses. I'm at a predominantly Jewish school, and I'm excelling above the Jewish students, and I'm a pre-med student, and I'm at the top of my class. And I totally disagree with you.
Yes. Yes, well, I'm glad to hear all of those things, but I do wonder why you say that you believe that the tests are biased.
Okay. Specifically, I would say, as far as elementary school is concerned, there were certain, well, the IQ test had certain cultural things, such as pictures from rural settings that these students never, I don't know why they were on the test. You know, maybe even a middle-class person in this particular area, which was West Haven, Connecticut, wouldn't really have been exposed to this. But it's just that a middle-class family would have probably taken their children on trips. I know my family took me on trips when I was younger, whereas somebody from a poor environment, as I said, the white students that I taught, unfortunately they came from families where the parents had their own problems, and they didn't have these cultural experiences, and they didn't know these things. We went on a trip to a farm, so maybe they learned a little bit there. But
there are stories of city kids putting antlers on cows, etc. There are all kinds of, we've heard...
They don't know these things. They have had no exposure to this.
Right. Now, such items may or may not be biased for a particular group, you see. I call these types of items culture-loaded. And then there are other types of tests that are culture-reduced. And
you want to use this? The visual we just had? Let's use that.
Yes,
We'll just show. It's over here.
See.
We'll have it for you here in just a second.
Oh.
This is an example of an aesthetic evaluation.
This is a culture-loaded type of item. It's not culturally biased necessarily. To determine whether something's culturally biased is it takes a particular kind of study.
Or what's the question here? What's the question that the test taker is asking?
The test taker asks the child, this is for small children, grammar school age children, pick out in each pair of pictures the one that is prettier. And you can see the man on the left would be the correct answer, the girl on the right would be the correct answer on the second one, and on the third one, the girl on the left.
All right, now what's the point?
Would be the correct. Well, this item is held up by critics of tests as a culturally loaded or biased item. I agree that it's culturally loaded. I'm not sure that it's culturally biased.
But the point is that there are geographies where aesthetic acceptabilities vary, are different according to the common features of the people indigenous to the region.
Right. Now,
so the next question is, why ask a question like this in the first place?
Well, I don't know. I wouldn't include that in a test if I were making it up, and I think it should be eliminated from
the test. All right, but it's in your book, and you wanted to make a point. What point by putting it in your book?
The point is that particular item is no harder in relation to other items in the test for blacks than it is for whites, you see.
But,
black children just as frequently as white children in relation to their performance on all other items of the test.
But look, you don't have to be a PhD, pardon me, doctor, if you ask a black child which is the prettier woman, and you, in effect, culturally force him to choose a clearly white blonde woman on the left here, as opposed to the broad-nosed person on the right, you are enforcing his own you are enforcing the difficulties that are presented to the victims of racism.
And that's why it's a bad item. I didn't make up that item. That is an item from the
doesn't this test make this woman's point?
That item may. I don't know for sure whether that item does or not. but most items don't. Now, the reason that I think that we have to look beyond these culture-loaded items in tests is because there are tests that are not culturally loaded in this way, and blacks perform about the same on those, that is just as far below the white average, as they do on these culturally loaded items.
Right.
Now, the Raven's progressive matrices that I gave you a copy of, I don't know what's become of it,
right here.
is an example of a culture-reduced test.
Is this
And
it? Look at your monitor.
the red-colored book. No,
Oh, no.
that's
Well, let's
that's another item.
Okay, but I want to show our audience this. I'm
All right.
sorry to interrupt, but this is the kind of thing that'll drive you crazy. Now, pretend you're in the SAT tests now, and your father really wants you to go to Stanford, all right? And your mother is breathlessly waiting, and you've got all these people in there, heavy breathing in the room, people concentrating, erasers are going and so on. Could you fill that in?
Well, I
No,
can tell
show me
you,
again, Ronnie, because you...
most people in this room would have no trouble filling that in.
Really?
I'm not sure that the picture is clear enough on that monitor to see. I can't see it that well from here to fill it in myself.
All right.
But that's a fairly easy item for adults. 90% of the adult population could probably do that item.
You think so, huh?
Yes.
All right, I'm gonna say number 6.
I can't tell you whether you're right from over here, but it's not that
Number
not that
6
important.
is each series has a different hat and a different shape of the face. So we've got a circle, a diamond, and an oval. Diamond, oval, circle. Oval, circle. We need a diamond, and we need a different hat. Here's the diamond, and here's the different hat, which has as yet not been placed in this sequence.
Right. Well, you see, it did involve some mental manipulation and reasoning, and it's a pretty good item for that reason.
Oh, wait a minute. Now, wait a minute. We've got ears to contend with here. The ears
Yes.
are different. Hold it. So we've got figure 8 ears, regular ears, and triangular-shaped ears. All right? Figure 8. No, it can't be number 1 because we've already got this hat. So what we need is a figure 8 ear. It's number 6. All right? But remember, the clock is running. No, it can't be number 2. We've already got a circle. We've already got the circle. Well, do you happen to know what the right answer is?
I don't know, and I can't see
You mean
the figure
the grand...
clearly
Well,
from
all
here.
right, hold on a minute. We're going to...
Well,
All right,
I
here's
don't,
the point
I don't
now.
think this is
Here's
the best
point.
use of our
Pretend you're-
time.
Pretend you're a young... pretend you're 17 years old, and you've got to do this. Okay.
Hat has to be triangle. Number 6 is the correct answer. So I can see. See, you've got to have one
But
kind of...
would it be
set
nice
of
if
ears
all the
and so
people
on.
taking the test had the luxury of, calling a meeting on this? The point is that they don't. They don't. And we'll be back in just a moment. We're with Arthur Jensen. He's back in the storm of a controversy that would really developed in the first part of the 70s, bias in mental testing, in which, among other things, if you joined us late, Mr. Jensen's most controversial conclusion is that blacks score lower on IQ tests than whites consistently, and it's not the test's fault. It is your contention, and I don't have to tell you the ripple that's been caused by that observation and the potential consequences of it. Yes.
Well, I'm wondering if diet can play a part in any of this testing, because a lot of people at the end of the socioeconomic scale do not have a well-balanced diet.
This has been very thoroughly investigated here and in Europe, where they had severe famines at the end of World War II. And the general conclusion is that it takes extreme deficiencies of diet, extreme malnutrition to have any effect on mental development. The brain seems to be the most buffered organ in the whole body. And there is no sizable group in the United States that has sufficiently poor malnutrition to attribute any of its IQ variation to dietary factors.
Yes.
Well, I was just wondering how the doctor feels about Ralph Nader's recent position on all these tests and his campaign that they're totally inadequate.
Well, his campaign more specifically has to do with the forcing test givers to make public the results and also the manner of the development of the test, and also to apprise the person who took the test not only of their score, but how their score was evaluated.
Right. Well, I'm not opposed to that. It creates certain difficulties for the manufacturers of tests in that they will have to invent many more test items if they let out the items and the answers. This creates a considerable problem and may undermine the validity of tests until they can solve that problem. Now, we're working on tests that there's no practice effect on. That no matter how many times you take the test, it will not affect your score. This may seem
like you're just engaging in sort of mental gymnastics.
It's not mental gymnastics, no. It measures IQ. We haven't perfected this yet, but it'll measure the same thing that IQ tests measure without tapping knowledge. It gets right at the brain itself, you might say.
Doctor, I was wondering if you're familiar. My son was infant, 6 weeks of age, when he was tested, University of Illinois, with pictures and different shapes and colors, how they
6
react.
weeks of age?
Yes. Mm-hmm. And I did get a letter saying that he was in this test. Well, what's the difference with a black baby 6 weeks old and a white baby at 6 weeks old?
Well, first of all, let me say that you can't measure intelligence in children at 6 weeks of age or even at 6 months of age. You can give them some kind of a test, but you won't give them an intelligence test at that age. There's nothing you can measure on children at that age that will correlate with their IQs when they're at school age. And you can't predict a child's IQ at school age from anything you can measure when he's under 1 year of age.
All right. I just want to show one of these tests. This is the simpler version of, I'm not sure what it is that this test is supposed to show. If we come around here.
Well, this is a good...
This is the right answer, right?
Yes.
Obviously. Okay? But so what? What's the point here? What is it that you learn when the person gives the correct answer? If you're watching in black and white, this is going to be confusing. This is not only diagrammatical, it's also color-coded. Go ahead.
Yes, well, this test here is a very interesting and widely used test, especially in research on intelligence, because it gets at this general intelligence factor. It correlates with every other kind of mental test, and yet it does not involve knowledge of anything linguistic or verbal or numerical or factual.
Observatory. Huh?
Right. It's the ability to reason about very common things, lines and circles and so forth, things that are universally available to our experience in this particular society.
All right, so the conclusions you are drawing then result from tests which pretty much
which exclude cultural knowledge that are like this, yes.
It has nothing to do with Pythagorean theorem or mathematical...
That's right. It has nothing to do with what things...
so this is a common sense sort of deductive thing.
It's deductive reasoning and inductive reasoning. And it does not involve scholastic knowledge or cultural knowledge.
And we'll be back in just a moment. How do you deal with every racist, radical, insecure, frightened person in the country would be attracted to your thesis and applaud you for what's happening? Doesn't that make you nervous?
Well, it would if I believed that. I don't really believe that's the case. As a matter of fact, I think that there's nothing in modern differential psychology and in the contents of my books here that should give any aid and comfort to racists. Because I'm advocating treating every person in accord with his own individual characteristics. And colorblind tests can help us do that.
Yes, but
better than
embodied in your
statement
is one of the manifestations of human behavior that we want to avoid. What you're in effect saying is
the fact that there are human
treat
differences.
People according to their own capacities.
Right.
And it's this very attitude that got us into a circumstances where we have two countries today, a black one and a white one. I mean, that's one of the... Once you start assuming that some people can only learn so much and others can learn more, you're going to treat the latter with
I don't assume that. I don't assume that about any person on the basis of that person's race, but on the basis of his own individual characteristics. And people do differ in individual characteristics. And it so happens that races differ in many ways. But no one is called a racist if he investigates racial differences in blood pressure or in bone construction, or this, that, or the other thing.
Yes, but if you...
Why identify racial differences in behavioral characteristics or in the brain with the racism?
As long as employers, for example, or business people who make decisions about the career advancements of personnel, bring to that responsibility your conclusion that somehow people of color are going to be less likely to be less intellectually capable than whites, it's going to be harder for the exceptional, or for a black person who has talent, and you allow that many have more than whites, to have it noticed and manifested and to be rewarded for it.
If that's true, and to the extent that it is, and I think it is in places, I feel much safer with tests than I do with interviewers and people who are promoting people on the basis of subjective judgments.
I've been a temporary care mother for 13 years on newborn infants, and I, without a doubt, would say that the majority of my black babies have been much more responsive and much more in tune with living than the white babies, and probably would end up being smarter.
That's a universal finding. This is true of black babies up to about 1 year of age. They score considerably higher on child development tests of perceptual motor development. And African babies in Africa who are 100% African do even better than American black babies.
What are your culturally unbiased, colorblind tests say about the sexes?
They show no sex difference in general mental ability. There are sex differences in certain special abilities. Spatial visualization ability is somewhat lower in women than in men.
What does that mean, spatial visualization?
This is the ability to visualize three-dimensional figures in space and rotate them around. These kinds of questions.
Men can do that better than women?
Men do this better
Does it have to
than
do with
women.
eye-hand coordination, does it?
No.
Oh, I see. All right.
No, it's a purely mental kind of thing.
One other thing. I'm sorry we're so long here, but give us another example of a difference between the sexes.
Well, another difference that shows up, especially in childhood, is in verbal ability. Girls are advanced over boys in verbal development.
Translated, they can communicate ideas.
Right.
Right.
This tends to wash out.
Which explains why most talk show hosts are men. We'll be back in just a moment. And this book is titled Bias in Mental Testing. Do you support the SATs?
I do, indeed.
I mean, what do they do? I mean, why do we have to place competition into education? What does an SAT do other than allow a select few schools to continue their reputation of being the best, whatever best means?
Well, colleges have to select. No college can accept all of the applicants that it receives.
Well, does it have to be IQ? Why should IQ be the determining factor? Why can't it be geography or interest or...
Because the best single predictor is IQ, as measured by the SAT test. It's designed to measure a combination of achievement and IQ, and it does the job of selection better and more fairly than school grades or interviews or letters of recommendation. It's the best method we have.
Dr. Arthur Jensen, our guest, we thank you for your participation and hope you have a nice day. Goodbye, everybody.
Thank you.